Hi, this video will take you through some of the key content from the Organisational Management syllabus. We won't go through the whole syllabus, but we will pick out the areas that are commonly examined in the case study, and we will think about the types of tasks you may face from an E2 perspective. If you sat your E2 objective test recently, then this recap will probably be sufficient. If it has been a while, and the topics we discuss here are not so familiar, then you may need to do some more revision in preparation for your exam. Don't forget the case study can test anything, so you need to be prepared. The first syllabus area is strategic management. This is a very common area in the exam. There are some models and theory in this section, but many of the questions require you to take a common sense, commercial approach, rather than relying too much on theory. Here we can see the rational approach to planning. This shows you a process for developing a long-term plan, maybe a 3 to 5 year plan. This approach can be contrasted with the emergent view, which allows strategy to arise from environmental changes. The rational approach starts with the idea that we will first decide what the mission and the objectives of the organisation are. We will then look at what's going on within the firm, so an internal appraisal, and what's going on outside of the firm, whilst also considering our stakeholders. This allows us to generate strategic options that will enable the organisation to meet their objectives. The next stage is to choose the most appropriate strategic option before planning and implementing the strategy, and then finally reviewing and controlling the process. In the exam, you may need to consider the usefulness of this model for a particular scenario. So, a stable company needing a long-term plan may want to use a rational approach. It may not be so appropriate if the industry is dynamic. It can be inflexible and can constrain the organisation. Some cases provide you with the organisation's objectives. Some don't. You may need to advise the company how to formulate objectives, in which case the SMART criteria can be useful. You may also have to evaluate objectives. So let's think about these criteria. Specific refers to whether the objective states what is being measured. So profit would be more specific than success, for example. Measurable means there needs to be some kind of measurement reference: money, percentage, number of people, etc. An objective also needs to be achievable for it to have any value and be motivating. Relevance means that the objective has to be appropriate to what the organisation is trying to achieve. And obviously there needs to be a timescale. So an objective to achieve a profit margin on 15% needs to have a deadline at which point performance can be judged. Why don't you pause the recording now and make a note of what you think your organisation's objectives are? You can then probably find reference to them on the company website. You need to be comfortable with the concept of critical success factors in the exam and how they tie in with core competencies. A critical success factor can be considered from the industry perspective. What does an organisation need to do well to be better than everyone else? So, for example, an airline would need popular routes, efficient planes, and friendly staff. Once the company has determined the critical success factors, they can then ensure they have the right core competencies to achieve these factors. So an airline might set up a crew training programme to ensure they have the friendliest staff in the industry. The airline will then need to ensure that they have suitable measures to keep track of their performance. Key performance indicators will measure whether the core competencies are achieving what they need to by measuring the critical success factor. So the airline will measure the success of the training programme by looking at whether their staff are considered the friendliest in the industry. A SWOT analysis can be performed to show the overall position of the company. This is a useful technique to use when analysing the pre-seen information. So, if we were performing a SWOT analysis of Facebook, we might say one of their strengths is that they have a very strong CEO. If we were looking at BlackBerry, we might decide that one of their weaknesses is their poor reputation for the technology of their handsets. An opportunity for a firm like Amazon could be to set up its own logistics firm. And a threat for an airline like British Airways could be that they face increasing fuel prices. Performing a SWOT analysis enables you to summarise the pre-seen information on one page. You definitely need to consider stakeholders in most of your answers. You must make sure you consider the relevant stakeholders. So, an airline would have passengers, not customers. You may also use a stakeholder mapping exercise to consider the interest and influence of each stakeholder group. This will help you determine the appropriate action to take when they are upset with a particular decision. Value chain analysis helps us to understand the internal workings of the firm. There have been several past exam questions that specifically refer to the value chain. It is closely linked to the concept of generic strategies. If a company is aiming to be a differentiator, they would want as many of their activities in the value chain to reflect this. Think about Aldi. Aldi is a cost leader in the supermarket industry. If we look at their inbound logistics, they probably have very low-cost warehousing, maybe a couple of large warehouses in key locations. The operations of Aldi, what goes on in the store, can keep costs down to a minimum by having very basic store fittings. You don't tend to see lots of fancy shelving and display cabinets in a store like Aldi. If we looked at their outbound logistics, well, Aldi don't offer a delivery service, they are just store-based. Looking at their marketing and sales, they can keep the costs down by focusing on print adverts that are delivered to homes and online adverts, reducing the expensive costs of TV and magazine advertising. If we looked at service, we could say that they keep their costs down by restricting the credit cards that they accept, avoiding the credit cards that have very high fees. Looking at their support activities, so procurement for example, they will buy in bulk and probably use a range of overseas suppliers to keep their costs down. If we consider their human resources, they will use a large amount of unskilled staff, and they will generally train their staff to have flexible skills. So a team member can use the till, stack the shelves, work in the warehouse. If we look at technology development at Aldi, there is minimal store technology, unlike some of the other supermarkets that use things like barcode scanning for customers. And if we look at their firm infrastructure, their head office, for example, is in a small village in the Midlands. Compare that to Sainsbury's head office, which is a large building in central London. The value chain can help us understand the strengths and weaknesses of a company. let's have a look at some possible exam requirements. You may be asked to recommend how a particular change in strategy could be communicated. This may be to all stakeholders or to certain groups of stakeholders, for example, the shareholders. In a communications question, you need to think carefully about the message that you're trying to portray, as well as the method that you would use. So, are you trying to reassure? Are you trying to be positive? And are you going to use email communication or try to speak face-to-face to the relevant stakeholders? You may be asked to advise on how to react to stakeholder concerns in the light of a particular strategy. So it may be, for example, that you are asked to think about the employees and how they may respond to a particular issue. You may be asked to comment on the current board structure. Have they got a non-executive chairman? Have they got a balance of executive directors and non-executive directors? You may also be given some proposed changes to the board structure and asked to advise whether they will improve or actually affect the corporate governance of the organisation. You may be asked if the company's corporate governance is in line with best practice. A good idea here is to think about the main principles of the Corporate Governance Code in the UK. So having a separate chairman and chief executive, having non-executive directors, having an audit committee, those kinds of things can help you to guide your answer. You might just be asked to evaluate the current strategy. Is it in line with the mission? Is it utilising the strengths? Is it remedying the weaknesses? Is it combating the threats? You can also take a very pragmatic, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the current strategy? You may be given a proposed change to the strategy, maybe going overseas or selling a different product. You may be asked to explain the implications. What would it mean to the company? Is it appropriate? Is it sensible? Is it consistent with the current strategy? And if not, could it damage the current revenue streams? And what might be the major challenges associated with developing and implementing the new strategy? The next syllabus area is assessing the environment. This topic can be a very useful way of starting to analyse the preceding information, as well as being the subject of an exam question in its own right. One useful way of assessing the general economic environment is to use a pest or pestle analysis. You will probably not be asked to do this in the exam, but you can definitely use it to help gain a better understanding of the preceding information. We can apply this framework to a furniture manufacturer. Looking at political factors, we may consider the employment laws affecting a manufacturing facility. Thinking about the economic side of things, possibly foreign exchange may affect the prices of the raw materials for the furniture manufacturer. From a social perspective, more people are working at home and therefore may be wanting home office equipment, which may change the products that the manufacturer should be producing. In terms of technology, we could look at the technology that's used in the design process. From an environmental perspective, the manufacturer might want to consider the use of sustainable wood and also the disposal of any unwanted furniture. And in terms of legal, and we'd often include regulatory factors here, we could look at the safety standards required for fire retardant furniture. These help us to understand how much effect the environment has on the firm. A more specific analysis of the firm's immediate operating environment can be performed using 5 forces analysis. This can help you to understand why the firm is struggling to make sufficient profits, as it considers the competitive pressure facing the firm from a range of sources. Thinking about a budget airline, if If we looked at competition, there's a lot of different companies in the industry. Everyone is very price sensitive, and we would probably conclude that therefore competition or rivalry is very high. Looking at the suppliers, there are a limited number of well-known plane manufacturers, such as Boeing and Airbus, and they would therefore have some power over the airlines. Thinking about customers, depending on the route, there may well be lots of choice and little loyalty. This would give the customers high power. When we think about the threat of new entrants, we can probably conclude that the barriers to entry are high. Capital costs, brand, and the safety requirements all make it harder for a new airline to establish itself, reducing the power of new entrants. If we consider the threat of substitutes, for some routes, trains or boat transport may be an alternative, but they are likely to be less convenient and slower, and so may not represent a particularly powerful substitute. You might want to pause the recording now and think about how the 5 forces affect a company like IKEA. Another model which is less commonly used is Porter's diamond. This considers whether the nation in which the firm is based has determined how competitive the firm can be. If we think about furniture manufacturers, such as IKEA, based in Northern Europe, we might argue that factor conditions would include the natural resources, such as a good supply of wood, as well as infrastructure, including good road networks to transport the goods. High demand conditions in local countries will have ensured the manufacturers have refined their product before they start to expand overseas. There is a high presence of supporting industries, such as those which process raw wood products. And the rivalry amongst different furniture manufacturers in the surrounding areas will have meant that companies become adept at competing before they expanded to other areas. You can apply this model to the pre-scene, although you are unlikely to refer to the elements of the model in the exam. So, for example, you won't say, here are some factor conditions. But it can help you to understand if a company is likely to experience success when they are no longer in their home market. Although PESTLE may be a simpler way of analysing this. You are often given competitor information in the pre-scene. This may be developed further in the exam, and you can apply competitor analysis to the information. You basically want to know as much as possible about the competition, following the same strategic models that we have been applying to our own company. So no real model needed here, just a bit of common sense. Let's now see some of the possible exam questions in this area. You may be asked to evaluate the current competitive position of the company, thinking about its strengths and weaknesses compared to other companies in the industry. When you see the word evaluate, you need to make sure you show a balanced perspective of both positive and negative. You may be asked how the company can increase their competitive advantage, thinking about how they can apply Porter's generic strategies, possibly thinking of the value chain to improve their position. You may be asked to analyse the forces affecting the entity. You may want to use a 5 forces analysis here, although it's not necessary to use the specific headings, just use it as a way of generating ideas. You may be asked to analyse the market environment, or discuss the implications of switching to a new environment. This is where possibly Porter's diamond Or maybe pestle analysis can help you to come up with some thoughts. You may also be asked to analyse a competitor. Should a competitor mean that we change our competitive strategy? If they are dropping their prices, should we follow? Can we learn anything from them? And how big a risk do they pose to us? You may also be asked how to conduct competitor analysis, where you might get information from, and whether you can use big data. So, for example, looking at the social media feeds of your competitors to understand the issues they are facing. The next syllabus area is the human aspect of the organisation. There is lots of scope here for requirements in the exam, but there is a lot of scope for using common sense and your own experiences. You may remember lots of theories in this section of the syllabus from when you were studying E2. Here is just one example of these theories. Remember though that you are responding to a request from someone in your organisation in the exam. The exam is supposed to reflect real life, so you are unlikely to use this kind of theory to respond to such a request. Unless these theories are referred to in the requirements, you should answer the requirement using common sense and real-world experience, rather than lots of theoretical perspectives. There are often major changes occurring in the company in the case study exam. This can result in a change in culture required. Changes in the size of the company, the technology used, the ownership, can all affect the culture. You may also need to deal with two organisations combining, and the cultural clashes which may well ensue. This topic is closely linked to change management. Any organisation may be faced with conflict. Conflict can arise for many reasons, and you may need to discuss the possible causes of conflict, as well as suggest ways to resolve conflicts, either within the firm or with external parties. There are different ways to manage conflict, as we can see here. A firm may try and suppress the conflict and continue with business as usual. This will only work in the short term, but may be appropriate if a firm has an important contract to fulfil and needs to avoid disruption for a period of time. Compromise and negotiation can be a longer-term strategy to reduce conflict. This may be useful if there is some kind of employee trade union dispute arising. Ultimately, the most effective long-term approach would be to resolve the conflict by examining the root cause. This is not always as easy as it sounds. Think about any famous trade union dispute. Trying to get to the bottom of the real cause for conflict can be very tricky. Also bear in mind that some organisations might stimulate conflict and actually orchestrate it. Some firms believe that this will encourage innovation. Here are some possible topics and requirements for the human aspect of the organisation area of the syllabus. You may be asked to suggest ways of motivating staff. Think about what's motivated you in the past. Think about whether reward schemes are an appropriate idea. Can we encourage a different action through maybe giving people more responsibility? Can we train them? Can we give them extra skills? You can use similar ideas to think about how to retain key members of staff. Do try and consider the type of staff we're talking about. Are we talking about directors? Are we talking about salespeople? Or are we talking about shop floor workers? The way to retain these members of staff may be very different. You may be asked about the challenges in setting up a team and possibly think about the composition of the team using something like Belbin's team types. You may be asked to discuss the potential impact of national culture on the business, if, for example, the company has acquired an overseas firm. You may have to think about the cultural issues involved when combining entities, different ways of working, different ways of doing things. The firm may be trying to make cultural changes and you need to consider the difficulties that may be involved here. And you might need to think of the pros and cons of the existing culture and what it can lead to. Looking at conflict, you might need to think about possible reasons for the conflict. And you might have to think about how to handle the conflict, as we've just discussed. You may have to think about negotiation, whether internally or with third parties, and suggest suitable approaches. And you might have to think about how to manage the process of working with others. You also may need to think about setting up some kind of arrangement with another party, maybe a competitor, maybe a supplier. Collaboration is key in the exam. You may also need to think of factors to consider in managing a relationship with others. Possibly, there will be a question on collaboration and how to collaborate with other parties. The next topic is change management, a very common area in the management case study exam. Remember that there may be close links here with culture and the impact of changes to culture. There are quite a few theories of change management. Here is one, Lewin's force field analysis. This theory looks at what is driving a particular change forward and contrasts this with factors which may be resisting change. It is a useful tool to analyse a particular change, but doesn't necessarily provide any solutions. You're not advised to write in your answer, using force field analysis we can analyse the change. This will definitely be seen for what it is, name-dropping theory for the sake of it. This won't score marks in the exam. However, you may want an awareness that the change needs to be analysed before appropriate techniques can be employed to manage the change. You may remember this model from your studies. Lewin's theory suggests that to manage change it is important to first break down barriers to change, or unfreeze. Then you need to make the changes before cementing these changes through a process called refreezing. Although this is quite simple to remember, it can be quite difficult to apply in the exam, and so caution should be exercised if you decide to use it to answer a requirement on change management. Generally, the task is asking for something a bit more practical, and this approach can leave you tied up in theory without actually giving much in the way of useful advice. This is a useful and practical approach to managing change. The theory was developed by Kotter and Schlesinger, but there is absolutely no need to refer to these people in the exam. There are various ways a company can apply this model to managing change. One option is to just select one method from this list and try to make it work. So you might analyse the change and decide that the best approach is to try and negotiate with those affected. Another way to adopt this technique is to start at the beginning of the list, where there is arguably lower effort required, and then keep going until something works. So you can start by communicating with those affected. If you experience resistance, then you can try and encourage some participation in the change process. If this doesn't work, you can start to negotiate. Ideally, you wouldn't end up resorting to manipulation or coercion, But there may be situations where a quick solution is required, and these are the only options. You might want to pause this recording now and think about a change that you have undergone at work. What methods did management use to manage the change? Did they work? If they were successful, why were they successful? And if they weren't successful, why not? Here are some of the possible requirements you may have to respond to in the exam. You may have to advise a company on its change management process, given a particular situation. As we've seen, there are many theories you could use here. I generally would advise the 6 strategies of change. This is quite a practical approach, and you can think of more detail. So, how can you communicate the change? What methods of negotiation can you use? What types of facilitation can you offer? That can add quite a lot of detail to your answer. You may have to discuss the actual issues involved in change management. So thinking more here about what factors may be resisting the change, thinking about culture, thinking about people and their natural resistance to change. And you may be given a company's change management plan and asked to appraise it. Appraisal, similar to evaluation, is asking you for a balanced answer. So you need to think about what is good about the change management plan, but also what some of the weaknesses may be. The final syllabus area from E2 is project management. Some case studies lend themselves more to project management requirements than others. However, there will often be some sort of project in the unseen information which requires managing. This could be a major new strategy, such as an overseas development, or it could be something a bit simpler and more operational, like the implementation of a new system or a bit of technology. You need to be able to show an understanding of project management techniques, but as with many topics, you can definitely score a reasonable amount of credit with a bit of common sense and some real-life examples. You may need to think about the project as a whole. It can be useful to break down a project into the main elements. Think about the initiation phase, planning, execution, and completion. Consider what type of activities might take place at each stage. Initiation is where the project gets started. Roles are assigned, objectives are set, and the appropriate authorisations are obtained. A PID, or Project Initiation Document, will be used to record this. Planning is a crucial part of any project. It is important to think about each stage in project execution, plan the timings, think about any task interdependencies, and identify and assess the risks of the project. This plan then needs to be followed as the project is executed. Control activities are also important during the execution phase to ensure the project remains on track. The project then needs to be completed and signed off fully before being handed over to the business for long-term management. You may have to consider in the exam how to evaluate the success of a project at a stage in the process, any stage in the process. Although simple, this is a useful way of thinking about evaluation. All projects can be measured in terms of quality. Have they achieved what they set out to achieve to the required standards? Cost. Is the project on budget? And time. Is the project going to meet the required timescales? These areas are usually how the project manager is assessed as well. If you have ever been involved in a project at work, you may be familiar with some of the roles required for a successful project. The more senior stakeholders in a project, such as the sponsor and the owner, will prepare the project brief, obtain and allocate funds to the project, and set the project terms of reference. The project team, led by the team manager, will then prepare project proposals at the beginning of the project and status reports throughout, and these will be communicated back to all of those involved in the project. You may need to specifically think about the role of a project manager in the exam. It may be that you are advising on the recruitment of one, or possibly preparing a job description, or even thinking about performance appraisal. A project manager needs a range of different skills, as the role is very varied. You can remember these different skills by thinking of the mnemonic. Not preparing the project's financial plan could cause disastrous losses. Let's think about why each of these skills are important for a project manager. Negotiation. There are lots of different stakeholders involved in a project, all with different objectives. The project manager may need to negotiate with some of these to ensure all are satisfied with the outcomes of the project. Planning and control. If a project isn't planned properly, then it is unlikely to be successful. Particularly for large projects requiring a lot of resources. If the project isn't properly planned and controlled, it is unlikely it will achieve the required objectives on time and in budget. Technical awareness. Although project managers aren't technical experts, they do need some awareness of the subject matter. So, for example, an IT project doesn't require a heavily technical project manager, but they will need some general understanding of the technologies involved in the project. Financial awareness. As the project manager will be responsible for the budget, they will need a degree of financial awareness. Problem solving. Even the best planned projects will encounter problems. The project manager will be responsible for identifying ways to resolve these. Communication is important to ensure all team members and stakeholders know what is going on and what their responsibilities are. Change management. Projects often involve change, and therefore some of the stakeholders may be resistant to this. Change management skills can be useful in this situation. Large projects can involve a big project team, which can be difficult for one person to manage. Effective delegation will be key here. Finally, a project manager will need to show leadership skills to encourage all team members to work effectively and achieve the project objectives. Let's have a look at some possible exam requirements. You may be asked about the challenges associated with implementing and managing a project. Obviously, you will have to react to the specific situation, but think about some of the issues we've been talking about in terms of how project managers need to progress. You may be asked about a specific stage of the project, so possibly feasibility, that is part of the initiation stage, thinking about the costs of the project and the benefits of the project. You may be asked about implementation or execution and how we might monitor progress, so looking at things like the risk matrix of a project, looking at evaluating the project in terms of cost and time and quality. I hope you found this recap useful. You may have identified areas where you need to do some more revision. Just remember that the exam is generally looking for a practical response, so avoid using theory just for the sake of it.